This week, we're going to take everything we've talked about in terms of putting your type to work and apply it towards the report that you typed up from last week. This report should have been about a single font and only about 400 to 700 words, so roughly a little over a page, and it doesn't need to be stylized. We're going to be doing all the stylization this project for this week. I've got mine typed up in Microsoft Word now. But I'm going to do all of my design work in Adobe InDesign. This will give me full control over exactly what I want to do. The first thing we need to do in Adobe InDesign is create a new document. Now, of course, the size of this document is going to be measured in inches, and we want it to be just a standard letter size piece of paper. So 8.5 by 11 is the size of it. For now, I'm going to set my number of pages to be 2 pages, and I'm going to turn on facing pages, though we'll mark this up and change this just a little bit. We won't worry about the columns or gutter for now, and also the margins. I'm going to keep at the default 1/2 inch on all sides, though we will change this up a little bit later too. Also, if you want, you can include a bleed, but in my case, I'm not going to bleed anything outside the edges of my margins, so I'm going to set this to be 0 on all edges. We can say create, and this will give us our new InDesign document. And when you open your Pages panel, notice that you have 2 pages, but they're in facing pages or book pages layout. This means they're not next to one another, but they're going to be in sequential order the way a book would be laid out. What I want to do is have both of my pages side by side, so I'm reading them as if it's opened up in a book. In order to move your pages around, because if I click on it and try to drag it up, it's not going to do anything, we need to turn on or turn off Document Page Shuffling. So in your Pages panel, go up to your Page Options and unselect Allow Selected Spread to Shuffle. With that turned off, I should be able to select Page 2, drag it up, and now I can put them side by side, and I can see both of the pages side by side here. This way, I can treat this as a 2-page spread for my entire design. The next thing we need to consider are the margins for my page. Right now, the default 1/2 inch margins on the top, bottom, outside, and inside edges make this layout look very static and not too well designed. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. It'll actually read well, and there's lots of different ways we can set up our margins. However, if you want to use the golden ratio like we talked about in this week's lectures, there is a way you can set up your margins so that the inside margin edges are goldenly proportional to the outside proportion of your page. Here's how we're going to do that. To get started, I'm going to grab my line tool and set your line to be just a default black line with a 1-point stroke. So we'll set that to be 1. With this, I'm going to draw a line at the top left-hand corner down to the bottom right-hand corner of the next page. So notice it goes all the way across both spreads. This will give us a diagonal length for both pages. Now I need to get a diagonal length of just this one page. So I'm going to draw from the bottom left-hand corner up to the top of the middle of our spreads in just one page. And that'll give us a length of this page. Now I've got a ruler or a set that I can use to proportionally change my margins. In order to do this, what we want to do is we want to have our margin edges line up anywhere along these lines. So in this case, I need to move this either up or over in order to match up the black line, so the top and the outside edge. Same way with this inside edge. I can move this down or over to be proportional as well. Here's what I mean. So if I like this, I want to adjust my margins to match my black line. Go up to Layout, down to your Margins and Columns, and this will allow you to adjust the margin and columns of each of your pages that you have. In my case, I want to be able to move this top margin down and this inside margin over. So I'm going to unlink them, and I'll maybe move my top by increasing it. See how I can move it down, until it's just about touching. Now if it's off by a little bit, that's okay, or you can type in a specific amount. So if that's somewhere in between 0.625 and 0.68 should be just about right. We'll do 0.65 for mine. If I say OK, notice because I had both of my pages spread, it affected both sides as well. Let's go over and fix this margin. So if I bring my top down this much, I need to adjust this margin over until it's hitting this edge as well. Whoops, excuse me, let's go back up to the very top. Again, go up to your layout, margins and columns. Now I've already adjusted my top, and so I want to adjust this outside edge until it's moved over too. So I'm increasing my margin of the outside portion until it's hitting nicely along that edge. And we'll say OK to that. Finally, we can zoom back out. Let's go down to this bottom margin so we can see it and have the bottom edge come up until it touches right there. Again, layout, margins and columns, and then adjust the bottom margin until it's just about hitting maybe somewhere between 2.5 and 3. So we'll do let's do 0.28. And say OK to that. Now it's touching nicely. From here, when I check out both of my pages, now I've got nice margins that are proportionally using the golden ratio from the inside parts to the outside parts. I can now select my black lines and delete them away, and let's flow in some text. Before I do, and I want to emphasize this again, you do not have to set yours up exactly the same way that I did for mine. Feel free to play around with your own margins until you get something that you prefer and you like. To place my text, I'm going to grab my Type tool and let's make a text box inside of my margin edges on both pages. So here's one here, and we'll click and drag and create another text box inside my margin on my right-hand page. Now I can go up to File, down to Place, and let's find my report. So here's my report on my desktop, and I'll say Open. Notice it's looking for some fonts. Later on we'll change up these fonts. So if you get this warning, it's okay to ignore it. So I'll just say Skip. It's going to follow my cursor until I click inside of this first area. Now since I'm missing some fonts, everything's coming in as pink. So if this happens to you, what we really want to do is choose your Type tool and select all of the text. So Command A will highlight everything, and I want you to use the same font that you typed your report about. In my case, it's about the font Avenir. So with everything selected, I can go up to the top, I can type in Avenir, AV. Here's Avenir. Notice I've even got a variety of different weights that I can work from, but in my case I just want to use a regular Avenir. So there's Avenir Heavy, Avenir Next Heavy. Let's see if I got an Avenir Regular. Avenir Roman, that's the one we want. And now it's set to a font that I have on my computer. Another problem is, at this particular size, I don't have enough room to fit all of my report in one page of this document. I need to flow it into this next page. To do this in InDesign, if you don't know, you can select the little plus sign at the bottom. Notice that it follows my cursor, and when I click over here, it will link up both of these, and now all of my text flows from one to the other. Now comes the fun part of actually designing out your entire page. In looking at my text, you can see I've got a title, I've got some subheads or some section headers, and I've got the body copy that goes along with each of those as well. Now when you wrote your report, if you don't have any section headers, you can feel free to add on those into this design if you want. And it doesn't have to be anything special. In my case, I've got a simple introduction header, or or the name of the designer as a section header. What I would like to add is a subhead or a subtitle to my overall design. I'm going to call this Avenir, the sans serif of the future. This way it'll add a little bit more interest to my overall design and appeal. Next, let's start creating some differentiation between the headers, subheads, and even the chapter or section titles for each one of those. To do this, let's make my header much bigger. So this will be my main body. I can make it larger and really start to stand out. I can do other things like make it bold or change up the styling of it. I can also do things like change up and make it all caps or small caps. I actually like all caps to set that. If this is going to be my header, let's do something to my subhead. To make it a little bit larger, maybe I'll make this one small caps. See what that looks like. Maybe. Or if I made it all caps, let's go a little bit smaller. Again, this is where you can change it up to fit the needs of your style and your design. I just want it to have a different weight from my under part as well. Let's also do something consistent with each of my little section headers. So if this is going to be the introduction, maybe I want that to be nice and bold, so I'll make it a bold version. And if I do it to one, I want to be consistent and do it to all the other ones as well. So if that's the introduction, is set in Avenir Black, I can select this, and I'll set that to be black as well. Now it looks good with this. If you ever need to preview this with the margins turned off, of course you can go down to the bottom of your toolbox and click on the preview mode, and this will turn off everything and give you a preview of what it looks like. To go back to normal mode, you can select normal and it'll go back to here. Also, you can hit the keyboard shortcut of W and that will toggle back and forth between both of those. The next thing I can do is to start playing around with my body copy. Of course, body copy doesn't have to be 12 points in size. If anything, I can probably get away with it being much smaller. So I'm going to take this and let's make it down to, let's see what 9 point looks like. That's pretty small, but not too bad. Maybe 10 or 11. I'm kind of thinking either 10 or 11 would look good for this size. Let's see what it would look like for all of the other paragraphs too. So here it is, set at 11 point for all of these. That adds a good, nice difference between my introduction. And I can also play around with the indentation of each one of the body copy that I have too. Right now I've got a nice space between each of my paragraphs, but if I wanted to, I can select my body copy and then up at the very top, look for your indentations up at the side. If I wanted to move everything over on the left side, on all of them, I can increase this number by pushing that over too. We'll give it maybe 1/4 of an inch. Now there's a good set of hierarchy between all of those. Let's select this and give it a 1/4 inch pushed over on that side as well. If it helps, you can draw on a guideline. This will establish a guide for your eye as you push those into there. Another thing you could do is a first line indent. But in this case, since I've got a nice white space between us, I didn't need a first line indent. Looks like I do need some establishment for this one. So I didn't select that. Let's set that to be smaller and of course moved over 1/4 of an inch on that side too. If I've got a section that doesn't have or has more than one paragraph, in this case this one has 2 of them, and I don't want to have a white space between it, this is where I can select that second paragraph and I can add a first line indent up at the top. Now my first line indent needs to be something that matches my leading. If I go over here, I can see my leading is roughly 13 points. So I can go up to my first line indent and type in 13 PT, and that would be an appropriate amount of indentation for this line too. Let's back out. I'm kind of liking that. That way it looks like each little section has its own little area, but when it comes to 2 paragraphs, that one fits nicely. Remember, when you do a first line indent, you only need to do that to your second paragraph and not to the first one. I need to do this to my other page as well. So let's get rid of the space between here. We'll zoom in. I'll select this one and we'll give it a first line indent of 13 PT at the top. Now it's fitting nicely inside of there too. Right now it's looking pretty good, but let's see if we can start to make this fill out both of the pages a bit better by adding some grid structure. Right now I've got a large open area that I can easily work with, and everything's just flowing by default from top to the bottom. If I wanted to break this up into multiple different columns, here's how we can do this. First off, I'm going to go up to my layout for my margins and columns. And let's add multiple columns to here. Notice as I increase this number, it's going to start to add some guidelines inside of our margin edges. Now for now, I can keep it at 2 columns, and we can set our gutter to be that 13 points as well. So 13 PT would be an appropriate amount of space for our gutter. When we say OK, even though I have margins, let's apply this to the text that we have. I'm going to choose my black arrow and then click on each of the different text boxes. So I've selected this text box and this text box. With that selected, look up at the top center of your control panel, and this is the number of margins, or excuse me, number of columns that we can apply to those text boxes. If I increase this by 2, you can see now this will flow all of my text into 2 different margins. And it fits well with the margin guides that I've set up in the back. Now you see when I do this, it's going to start to play around or mess up my headlines that I have. In order to fix this, this is the advantage of using InDesign. We need to place my headline text and even my subhead perhaps in its own text box. So to do this, I'm going to grab my type tool and I'm just going to highlight my headline and subhead. I'm going to cut it away and I'll get rid of all of this. And then I'm going to take my text box for my body copy and I'm just going to make it much shorter. This will give us some open room here. You can see how that pushes nicely over to there. Again, grab your type tool, and I'm going to make a new text box at the top, and then paste in my new headline. Now that I've got my headline in its own text box, I can move it around and place it. I can even resize it wherever I want from here. And this is a great way of giving me some flexibility about the placement of my type once it's here. Even in looking at this looks very nice and dynamic for my entire design. The other thing I can do is I can play around with the rest of my text, making sure that it flows nicely and works well on both sides of the page. If I'm really interested in how things line up, this is where I can start to add a grid structure or even a baseline to my overall 2-page spread. In order to turn on your baseline, the first thing we need to do is establish it. Go up to your InDesign preferences and locate the units and increments. Underneath the units and increments, I actually told you the wrong thing. Locate your grids. Here's where we can set up our baseline grid. Right now, we're giving increments every 12 points, but remember, I've got some text on here that's 14 points in leading. So I need to have my leading match this increment. If I type in 14 point, we'll say OK. Nothing's going to happen just yet. So I'm going to go up to View, down to Grids and Guides, and here's where I can show my baseline grid. Now notice that I've got a blue lines every 14 points. By the way, if you don't see these blue lines, it's because you need to zoom in order to see it. Notice that when I zoom out, it'll eventually go away, simply because it gets a little bit confusing. However, all of my words aren't aligning themselves to that baseline grid. I want these to be nice and aligned on that grid structure. In order to do this, I'm going to select all my type, and then with the type selected, we'll go to our paragraph settings at the very top, and then look towards the middle for these 2 icons. By default, your text doesn't align itself to a baseline grid until you select this option to align it to the grid, and you can see it'll automatically jump down to that grid. Now everything is nice and aligned all the way across. And this only works for the text that you have selected. There is another problem, however. This text isn't aligning to the grid, and I've got it set to 17 points. If I do highlight my text and I tell it to align to grid, watch what happens when I do this. It's going to jump every other line. This is because this text is a different leading than what my grid structure has been set to. If that's the case for yours, it's okay, but just know that that's the reason why it's happening, is because it's having to jump to the next increment of 14. In this case, it's going all the way up to 28 points. I'm going to keep that off for now, but I can use this later on if I need to. If the grid line structure for your baseline does get off or get too confusing, this is also where you can go in and go up to View and simply turn off or hide that baseline grid. If you prefer, you can have a set of guidelines to create your own grid inside of your margins. To do that, go back up to Layout, and let's choose Create Guides. With this done, this will give you an option to create rows and columns of guides, and you can do it to the page, or in my case, I like doing it inside of the margin area. With this turned on, we've got Preview checked on as well. I'm going to remove my existing guidelines. I can increase the number of rows or the number of columns inside an area, and you can see now that's going to start to create my nice little grid structure. There is no set number of rows or columns that you need. However, since I've already got my text divided into 2 columns, maybe I'll keep my columns in multiples of 2. So I'll set that to be there. I can also do things like change around the gutter. So if I don't want my gutters to be so close together for the rows and the columns, this is where I can change those up and work within that particular setting. Maybe I'll set that to be closer to what the actual thing is for that. Now that I've got a 5x6 column structure, I can say OK. I can use this structure to start to move things and align them to the underlying grid. For instance, if I see this margin, maybe I can bring it up to fit nicely inside of there, and I can have the baseline of this text aligned to that part too. So now all that's nice and lined up. Or I can even bring this all the way up, and I can set my title for both of these to be set to the margins up here. And I can also move around and change up these parts of my text, and we'll set that to fit nicely within those margins. So this is where we're going through, and we're simply tweaking the layout of each part of your design. I want this text to be at the other edge. So I'm simply going to do a series of returns until it pushes it to the next part there. Now we're starting to get something that's nice, well aligned, and it fills up both sides of my text. Next, let's see if we can go through and clean up our text so that there aren't any typographic problems. Right off the bat, I can see that I have some widows and maybe some orphans on some different areas. So I've got one word automatically by itself. Now if I highlight this text, right now I've got everything left aligned, and I can see what it would look like as left justified. So both edges are nice and straight and there's no rag. That also corrected that particular problem. However, if I wanted to keep it left aligned, I could track it out just a bit by going up here and adjusting my tracking until it pushes 1 or 2 words back onto this edge. And you don't want to do it too much, but that actually fixed that particular problem with this. I could also go in and turn off my hyphenations by going up to the top and unselecting hyphenate. That'll give me a nice edge, but you can see how deep this rag is. So in this case, maybe hyphenations gave me a better alignment for those two, and I actually like the look of that. Let's go in here and see what we can do for these. Maybe for this body copy, let's see what this would look like if it was justified. And we'll look at it as a 2-page spread. I'm kind of liking the look of that, so maybe I'll keep this body copy justified and this one rag right. But when I do this, I want to go through and see if there's any awkward gaps inside of my text. I can see one happening right here. I usually have to squint my eyes. There's a open little channel right here. There's a couple of little channels that are awkwardly situated inside of these two. So in order to affect the channels, this is where I can go through and select it one line at a time. Maybe we'll track those out to give myself a little bit more room between both of those just to fill in that space. Now when I do this, it's going to push some of my text, but that's okay. We'll go through and we'll fix any of those. Do I see any over here? Nothing too major. Here's some major gaps between these. Oops, not the leading. I can track those out until those disappear as well. As long as it's not majorly noticeable, usually that's good for this. Another thing I can play around with is my kerning. I see this A and V. There's a lot of space between here and not so much space between all of the others. So I'm going to place my cursor between both of those. Let's adjust my kerning to bring that in until it's nice and optically aligned with those two. Even with this, let's see if I can get away with it being much larger and filling out that area. Of course, this means I need to bring down my body copy there. Let's actually select it, make it much larger. I want it to go all the way to the edge of my margin. That's looking good. Then we'll bring it up and place it inside of that. So in looking at my layout, let's review everything that I've put into this design. First off, I have a good sense of layout in my margins because all of my margins are different and they're proportional to the golden ratio. I've used a font that's got a variety of different weights to it, and I've used the same font that I've typed up about my report. The headline has a subhead, and both of those are in two different stylings, and so there's a sense of hierarchy with this. There's a further sense of hierarchy because I've got my opening paragraph have a different color and weight than the rest of the body copy. And even all of the subheads have a different weight as well, and they've got a different alignment. This is a different set of hierarchy because the proximity of my introduction is closer to the headline, so it differentiates itself between the body copy. And also there's the proximity and alignment inside of all the headlines, so there's not too much space between each one of those, but there is enough space between each of the different paragraphs so that it flows and reads really well as well. The final thing we can check for is to make sure our ligatures are turned on and being used, and also that we're not just using foot and inch marks for quotation and single quotation marks. Now, in order to turn on your ligatures, in InDesign it may be turned on by default, but you can go up to go down to Window, down to Type and Tables, and open up your Character panel. Inside the Character panel, you can see that my ligatures is checked on. This means whenever I bring in any kind of font, if there's a ligature that's part of the font and used, it'll automatically be used inside of this area. Now in my case, however, this particular font doesn't have any ligatures that are placed with it. But let me show you what this would look like if I have it turned on or not turned on. I'll use Minion Pro as my example. So if I was to type out something like FI, or FFF, or ET. No, ET won't be good for this one. Let's zoom in and have a look at these particular fonts. Notice that F and I are joined together. I don't have the little dot above the I, and these two F's are joined together. Versus if I kept typing an F, it automatically readjusted. This is because it's replacing both of those as its own individual ligature. Now if I highlight it, you can see it gives me that as an option to place that in there too. However, if I turn off my ligatures, this will separate both of those out. Now I can see both of those are different. So on your character panel, do make sure ligatures is turned on and it will automatically place those inside the correct areas that you need to use. The other thing we can play around with are our numbers and our quotations. And to do this, this is where we may need to turn on our individual glyphs. For instance, I can see the word future has a quotation mark inside of it right here. Now, to make sure that's a quote and not an inch mark, let's go up to Type and open our Glyphs panel. The Glyphs panel gives you all of the different glyphs or typefaces within your font. And we want to use the font that we're using, so I've got Avenir selected down at the bottom. I can scroll through and I can see all the different parts of this entire font. However, if I want to see just punctuation, here's where I can set those. So in this case, to make sure that it's a left quote, I can double click on it and it'll automatically place that quote inside of there. If I select this one, I can see it's automatically set to be a right quote for those two. And both of those are two different designs. Notice that this one is different from the little inch mark that would automatically be typed if I was typing just the quotation mark on my keyboard. So I can go through and I can correct any one of those inside of my design. Also, if you see that you've got numbers, you can use your lining numbers if it's part of your font family. In our case, we'll open up our numbers. And for my font, I only have one set of numbers, so I don't really have any lining numbers. But you can see I also have some fractions that are commonly used, and if I had fractions to use on mine, I can place those inside of there. But if you've got body copy, make sure you've got lining numbers, old style numbers turned on if it's inside your body, or if you've got larger numbers for your head, this is where you can add lining numbers up to the top. Once you're satisfied with the layout of your entire design, I want you to save this as an Indesign file so that I can see the layout of your entire design. I want to see how you set up your margins. I want to see your fonts that you've used, how you flowed the text, and how you've dealt with all of the different things. What I don't want to see is any pictures or any other line work, drawings, other things that could accompany this. All I want to see is to create a good page layout and simple design using only these techniques and only the type that you've created. So I'm going to go up to File and Save. I'll save this on my desktop in my case as Ivy Report Layout. Make sure it's an A right there. And we'll keep it as a simple Indesign file. This Indesign file is what you'll upload to Moodle for this week's project grade.